protesting that there is no equipment. So
I'm here on strike because I get no personal protective equipment here at McDonald's. I'm the one who's the most
Welcome back to Socialist Sundays with the International Socialist Alternative, with this week's talk of the fight for socialism in 2020. My name's Toya with International Socialist Alternative in the United States, and today we're having an exciting discussion about MayDay. For those who are tuning in for the first time, the International Socialist Alternative is an organization with sections around the world fighting for demands to drastically better the lives of workers and youth in countries on every single continent. We are socialists that understand that capitalism as an economic system creates massive inequalities and has allowed for the super wealthy of this world to hoard our resources and are actively putting human health and the health of this planet at risk every single day. Take some time after this segment to check out our website and get involved with a section in your country. Today, we're going to talk about MayDay, which is International Workers' Day. We saw massive demonstrations around the world of workers demanding things like fair wages and health protections and much more. Many of our sections in International Socialist Alternative participated in things like social distance protests and car protests, and also held online rallies that you can check out on your Facebook and maybe find in your own language. May this year is like no other. Why? Of course, because we're in this massive pandemic. And while we have a crisis in capitalism and are on the brink of economic greater depression than we have ever seen before. Today will be a discussion to celebrate working class struggle, but also talk about what the movement needs to go forward. So for this week's broadcast, I'm going to be asking some questions to our speakers, but also we're going to take some live questions. So be sure to put your questions in the comments. So first, let's say hello to everyone we have today. First, we're going to go to Brazil, a member of the International Socialist Alternative Executive, Andre. How's it going, Andre? Then we're going to head over to the US. We have Socialist Alternative National Organizer, Bryan. Hey, Bryan. And then we're going to go to Europe in Sweden, a member of the International Socialist Alternative Executive, Liv. Hi, Liv.
Hey.
So before we get to our first question, if everyone viewing could let their friends, their coworkers, their neighbors know that they're watching this today, we want to help spread the word. So share the stream on your social media, on your Twitter, on your Facebook, on your Instagram. Also, you can start a watch party. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you can always stay up to date as we do these shows every single week. So let's get started. First, I'm going to go to Bryan in the US. I have a question for you. If you could answer, how did the labor movement internationally celebrate the 1st of May at a time when much of the world is on lockdown?
Yeah, obviously our tactics for protests, for rallying, for actions of the workers' movement need to change in this situation. I'll focus on the US, where social distancing protests have been carried out by healthcare workers for quite some time. The US has become the epicenter of the crisis, and a large part of that has to do with the fact that our healthcare system is entirely in private, corporate, profiteering, hoarding hands. And so healthcare workers have been carrying out social distancing protests at shift changes, demanding personal protective equipment, demanding a Medicare for all system, and demanding taxes on the billionaire hoarders who are making this crisis far worse than it has to be. There's also been car protests. Caravan Socialist Alternative participated yesterday in a caravan in Seattle to tax the biggest corporation, the richest man in the world, in order to provide adequate housing for working class people. And throughout the country, participated in caravans for the Rent Strike 2020 movement to cancel rent, to prevent landlords from using this crisis to drive up their profits and drive us out of our homes. The most excitement that we've seen around protests in the US on May Day were around these worker walkouts in mostly non-union workplaces, where people took sick days as well in some of the biggest corporations in the US. Amazon, as I've mentioned, Target, Whole Foods, McDonald's, Walmart, etc. But we also need a sense of proportion about what these walkouts represented. They were very, very, very small, but it's still a step forward in terms of workers in non-union workplaces stepping up in order to take action. They were small and they were isolated, but they won some attention and have won some demands for safety. But also the organizers of these protests, like Chris Smalls in Staten Island around Amazon, for instance, have been victimized and targeted by corporations, which shows that the billionaires, while working class people are essential and crucial to get us through this pandemic and are demanding the things that can take us forward, the billionaires are the ones making it worse, making us sicker, and victimizing workers who stand up for all of us. And this has come, these actions have come also when there was an upsurge in the labor movement in 2017, 2018 with teacher strikes and actions among grocery workers as well. But at the same time, again, a sense of proportion is needed here. The labor leaders, for the most part, despite the development of a labor left around the nurses in the last few years and the teachers, the labor leaders have been missing in this crisis. There is no clear voice for working class people, and that's made even worse by the fact that right now, Bernie Sanders is focused on telling people that they should unite this Democratic Party and support Joe Biden. So that's the situation with labor, and I'll just briefly touch on rent strike. In the US, in April, 1/3 of all apartment renters were unable to pay their rent. And we think that when the figures are gathered, that could potentially be even higher in May. In addition to that, there's an online petition, which is another organizing tool that people are using during social distancing, with over 2 million people saying that the rent needs to be canceled and that working class people should take action if the rent is not canceled, with no mortgage payments, no rent payments, no utility payments, and no back payments owed for rent that's unable to be given to landlords. So Socialist Alternative has been working with others to organize, these millions of people that can't pay the rent into an actual movement that can last beyond this pandemic and can make clear demands that can benefit the lives of working class people going forward. Building by building, getting organized among tenants to negotiate with their landlords and to fight back and to become a lasting organized force. Yet at the same time, we can see what the working class, the poor, and the left are doing in this pandemic. We should also state that there's protests on the other side of things. Protests of mainly middle class, small business elements, but egged on by the right wing in the Trump administration and the far right, calling for the reopening of the economy with no clear protections for working class people. And so in general, what happened on May 1st with these protests on both sides, it shows a deep polarization in US society, a political polarization, but also an economic polarization and a social polarization as well. And this points towards explosive events, explosive struggles going forward.
Thanks so much, Bryan. Now I want to go, though, to Liv in Sweden. Now, oftentimes, the way the US is organized and runs their economy is oftentimes pitted against the way Sweden does, and it's used as an example. So I think it'll be interesting to hear how kind of an opposite country, in the eyes of many working class people, is handling this lockdown and also organizing that's happening. So Liv.
Yeah, I mean, first, Sweden isn't actually in lockdown, not in a full lockdown. So there should be better possibilities for workers and communities in Sweden to actually organize. But we also have a situation where for decades, the trade union has been in a suffocating grip of extremely right-wing, bureaucratized leadership. And the level of workplace struggle has been extremely low for a long time. But despite this, it is a sign of the times that we are actually seeing struggle emerging, even if it's on a very low level. In particular, in the last few weeks, we've been seeing trade union safety reps calling brief work stoppages over issues of PPE, personal protective equipment, in hospitals and in elderly care, and warning of those kind of stoppages, which is something that we wouldn't have seen before. Which is, you know, when this is happening, even here, even in a situation where struggle is on a really low level, it says something that things are on the move. But this is really, really modest compared to what is happening elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in the world, where we're actually seeing like the beginnings of a global strike wave happening on these issues. And I also have to say that, I mean, what is happening in the US is followed really closely. It's really, really inspiring to hear what, despite, you know, the challenges that Bryan is highlighting, the limitations that he's highlighting, it really stands out for me, the kind of creativity and courage that workers in the US are showing, are putting on display actually for the whole world. I mean, the US, being the belly of the beast, is kind of like a showroom to the world, and when it comes to, when it's struggle that's put on show, that's really quite significant. And I also think that, I mean, in country after country, we are finding that the initial response to a crisis is this sort of wet blanket of a paralysis, that there's this story that we're all in the same boat. Solidarity and responsibility is sort of falling in line behind your government, behind your boss, sort of shoulder to shoulder, cheering on the national team in the COVID fight. And what is really striking also from what Bryan is saying and from what is happening across the world is how quickly workers are actually smashing that story, are breaking that myth down. And I mean, because of what is the low level here in Sweden, I mean, I think my other home country is more exciting to speak about what's happening there in South Africa, where we also had this issue of sort of initial paralysis, especially no lead coming from the trade union leaders, including the left trade union leaders. But things are beginning to move. On MayDay, actually, there was a very creative protest as well by healthcare workers, calling a press briefing, which turned into a picket outside the country's biggest hospital in Soweto. Also for PPE and for healthcare for all, not, you know, hell for the poor, as they were saying. And neighboring Zimbabwe as well, they're way ahead, having fought on these issues against the authoritarian government there for a while. So on MayDay also, nurses actually blocked hospital entrances, demanding not only PPE, but actually such basics as water, food in the hospitals, as getting paid to actually be able to get to work. This is in a country which has 7 ventilators to 60 million people.
Thanks so much, Liv. Those numbers are absolutely shocking, and it's inspiring to hear what workers all over the world are doing. I want to head to Brazil to talk to Andre. Hearing from what Bryan and Liv said, what does this mean for socialist organizing?
Well, Toya, in fact, we have a very contradictory situation here, because we are living in a special moment that requires an effective intervention by the socialists. But at the same time, in many countries, we cannot intervene as we have been doing before. Obviously, our sections are intervening in the struggles, like these examples explained here by Liv and Bryan. But there are serious limitations to action in the streets, in workplaces, schools, and universities, in the neighborhoods, etc. at this moment. But we must seek to overcome these limitations and develop new methods of intervention and struggle. We have to accumulate strength for the next period, because in this context of crisis and popular anger, the organized intervention of socialists becomes a decisive question. So the crisis and the expansion of the pandemic make explicit the failure of the system. It shows that the king is naked. The king of neoliberalism and capitalism is naked. Many people are beginning to understand this, even if they do not draw all the conclusions on that. Even before the pandemic and the deepening of the economic crisis, there was already massive dissatisfaction in many countries. This was reflected in several mass uprisings and mass struggles in 2019. We have seen here in Latin America and in many countries this kind of struggles. And with the pandemic and the crisis now, the questioning of the current order deepens even more. In this context, the organized action of the socialists may be the key factor that can lead to victories or defeats in many of the struggles that exist and the struggles that will come. Our role is to help accelerate the process of consciousness, the understanding of the necessity of a global system change and anti-capitalist and socialist alternative. This is what we aim, for example, with the ISA statement on the May 1st. And I call all comrades to read it on our website. In this material, we summarize 5 reasons to fight for socialism in 2020 as a direct conclusion of the suffering and calamity to which millions of people are subjected at this moment. But there is no point in having written this important material if it doesn't reach workers and young people. So we have to take these ideas to them despite the current limitations with quarantine, lockdown, curfew in many countries. So this video broadcasting activity that we are doing now is an example of how to do it. ISA has been making live video broadcast every Sunday with an important impact. The use of internet and social media played an important role, obviously. Comrades have already talked about the virtual rallies, online rallies that many of our sections did on May 1st. So propaganda and agitation on internet are a way to reach more people. Articles, analysis, reports on our webpage play an important role. Our meetings must also to continue to happen in this situation. So no socialist organization works with democracy, unity, and effective action if there are no meetings where the members can express opinions, debate, to prepare action, and jointly take decisions. So in most ISA sections, we have held branch meetings by video conference. The same goes for political education activities for sympathizers and supporters. Many times we have even managed to get more people together than in a normal situation, in a normal situation meetings that we have. So yes, at one side, virtual meetings have some advantage. Just to give an example, here in São Paulo, where I live, it can take up to 2 hours for a comrade, for example, to travel to a meeting within the same city. So it's very difficult for comrades from the periphery of the city to participate in meetings. But now many are participating more, and this revitalizes the organization. But at the same time, it's important to be clear. Nothing will replace a face-to-face meeting and the direct contact with workers and activists. And we have to prepare ourselves to return to this kind of action when conditions allow. Another important point is the financing of our struggle and our work. We always finance ourselves independently, appealing only to our members, workers, and supporters of our cause. It's more difficult to do fundraising activities if we cannot go out on the streets and sell the paper and ask for contributions to our fighting fund. But we can make financial appeals using internet, and we are doing it. In Brazil, this is a vital point. We are making financial appeals to sustain our work and at the same time intervene in a reality where many workers and many members of our own organization are completely without any social security, lost their jobs, or without any income, etc. So the spirit of solidarity that is inherent of the experience of the working class has been developed these days, and the response has been very good. So concrete fights, concrete struggles are going on in various sectors in different countries, as comrades Bryan and Liv explained. We can intervene on the ground and also use weapons like comrades have used in different countries, like the website in the US, Workers Speak Out, is to put the voice of the workers in the workplaces and etc. So there are similar experience in other countries. So the socialists must use this special moment to accumulate the forces, to develop the cadres, to strengthen our understanding of reality and prepare ourselves for when concrete intervention in the streets, in the workplaces, in the neighborhoods and schools and campuses is possible. So it is there on the ground that we will organize a powerful socialist force capable of changing the world.
Thanks so much, Andre. You gave a lot of information on how socialists can continue to organize during this time. You referenced an article that's posted below in the comments. And I also want to plug what Andre just mentioned at the end, which is on Facebook. You can check out Workers Speak Out, where we have tons of workers around the world who are essential or even non-essential workers that are being forced to work during this crisis, and connecting and organizing with others across sectors and across industry. So it's super important that we're still organizing ourselves. We're still having meetings, and International Socialist Alternative is taking that quite seriously. But this also brings up the question about what Bryan mentioned earlier, in that there's major issues everywhere about lifting the lockdown restrictions. Although Liv mentioned not every country is in a lockdown, there are many countries that are. And so what should the approach of socialists be to this, and what can the working class movement do to stop lives being put at risk for profit? Let's go to Liv first.
Thanks. I think firstly we should note that all along it has been worker strikes, worker protests, like what we've been hearing tonight, that have actually pushed governments ahead of them into lockdowns and restrictions in different forms. Because through and through this crisis, capitalists and their politicians have been putting business as usual and their profits ahead of health. The backbone reaction of regimes, from the one-party dictatorship in China to the Trump circus to like even the most self-righteous of democracies like Sweden, have been to, on a scale of course, but has been to ignore, deny, underestimate, and cover up the full extent of the danger posed. And then when actually going into lockdowns or restrictions, governments have used them as much to sort of strike preemptive blows in the intense class war that they know is coming, going out of this, with curfews and restrictions on democratic rights and worker rights in particular. And now there's this race from ruling classes across the world, racing for the exit, trying to get their particular economies back up and running, getting ahead of each other in a world which is increasingly filled with tensions and inter-imperialist rivalry. So not motivated by science, by anything rational really, is very striking. And as socialists, of course, we've never trusted these governments with protecting us with lockdowns. And we've been pointing to the excesses and the missed marks in these lockdowns, like non-essential businesses continuing to operate, or imposing massive restrictions on democratic rights, on movement, that are probably not of much effect, and actually like medical effect, but have serious impact on mental health, for example. So of course we don't fall in line behind big business lobbies that are behind the push for the exit now. Instead, as socialists, we are urging workers and working class communities to fight back against these premature exits, to effectively refuse and veto the exits on the basis of really careful estimation of like the scientific evidence on how best to battle the disease, on your own expert knowledge of your workplace, what is safe, what is not safe. Obviously, where there's uncertainty, on the science, we need to push for better safe than sorry kind of approach. At some point, restrictions and recommendations, what have you, will have to be eased, but the when and the how cannot be left in the hands of big business owners who are driven by their chase for profits, by trying to outdo each other in this growing battle for survival amongst themselves. And that applies, I mean, not leaving it in their hands, that applies also to the big business political parties. And also taken on their own to the experts, as long as they account not to working class interests, but to big business interests, to the limits that are set by capitalism and profit first kind of system. Like in Sweden, I mean, it's very striking here that, because we have that like sort of expert guided government, they say. And the experts here are clearly compromising their professional advice to government, probably without even seeing it themselves, because they're thinking inside the capitalist box. They cannot conceive of mobilizing the vast resources of society that are locked up in private business, that would enable us to sustain a much more coherent and longer lockdown, that would enable us to provide proper PPE, training much more staff in healthcare and so on, employing many more. So I think like what the situation shows in reality is that there should be democratic working class control over what measures are in place and for how long they're in place. So I think what the workers' movement needs to do and can do right now is to push from the grassroots, because it's also been a case of pushing from the ground up on union leaders to define what is essential and not, what is safe and not. And continue to show that active combative trade unions save lives, struggle saves lives, and also this is linked to actually pointing towards a socialist transformation of society is showing itself to be an essential need.
Thank you so much, Liv. And yeah, here in the US, it's clear that the ruling class and Trump is not worried about putting people's lives first. They want to open up the economy back up. I want to head back to Brazil, though, because we have some comparisons with our president. We have, you know, Trump and Bolsonaro kind of coming from the same realm of thought. But here in the US, you know, the state governors took, you know, a little bit more ownership over the people that they govern, and some states are shut down. But what's the situation like in Brazil with Bolsonaro?
Well, Toya, this question about the loosening up of quarantine and these measures of restriction is a vital issue in Brazil now. So the country is going fast in the direction of a catastrophic situation of historic proportions, and the government is a fundamental part of the problem here. The president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, continues to deny the seriousness of the pandemic and advocates an end of any measure of social isolation, quarantine, lockdown, etc. State governors have adopted some of these measures, but in permanent conflict with the federal government. However, even the state governments are already beginning to relax quarantine in an absolutely criminal manner at this moment. This happens at the worst moment of the pandemic in the country. Brazil has already surpassed China in the number of deaths and is now among the 10 countries with the highest level of deaths in the world. The trend is that Brazil will soon become the epicenter of the global pandemic. We already have 1,000 new deaths every 2 days. And in a recent research by Imperial College London, Brazil has the highest rate of infection of the new coronavirus among 48 countries analyzed. In a country with such great social inequality as Brazil, the effects of the pandemic are multiplied. So the group at a higher risk here are the poor people. So people that lives in the peripheral areas, the favelas, the slums, where prevention is much more difficult, the healthcare is precarious, and there are many other poverty-related diseases present in these areas. So since the beginning of the pandemic, for example, São Paulo's, the city of São Paulo's wealth areas, for example, have more cases, but a fewer number of deaths than the poor areas. And this shows what this means for the working class and poor people here. So along with the serious health, economic, and social crisis, we have a deep political crisis in the country at this moment. When asked about the dramatic growth in the number of deaths in Brazil, Bolsonaro cynically answered, "And so what? What do you want me to do?" So this guy, the president of the country, is a conscious genocide. There are great divisions among the bourgeoisie at this moment in Brazil. Key ministers like the health minister and now the justice minister have resigned. In the case of the justice minister, Sérgio Moro, he's accusing Bolsonaro of many crimes. There is also a conflict between the federal government and state governors, and also with the Congress and the Supreme Court. Bolsonaro, in reality, invests in social and political chaos to try to implement his authoritarian and Bonapartist project. The traditional right-wing politicians try to recover the space they lost in last elections with the rise of the pro-Bolsonaro extreme right, and the military tries to intermediate the situation among the different sectors, and they are gaining political strength inside and outside the government. So only the re-emergence of the mass movement of the workers and poor people can confront this terrible scenario. We are intervening now and preparing ourselves for the new struggles and even social explosions that are to come in the next period. Our organization in Brazil is intervening in the struggles that are happening now. For example, the blockade of the head building of the Federal Institute of Education in Natal, in the northeast of the country. That is a movement against the authoritarian intervention of Bolsonaro government at this university. The comrades there play a central role in this struggle. We are also part of the metro workers struggle here in São Paulo for secure conditions of work. We also helped to organize solidarity campaign in the poor areas here in the eastern zone in the city of São Paulo. So all these interventions we are doing are linked with a political campaign based on a general ideas like we will not die of hunger or virus. Let the super rich pay for the crisis and kick out Bolsonaro and the Vice President Mourão and the new liberal agenda. So that is the key question at this moment to build the struggle.
Thanks so much, Andre. And as we're discussing, the ruling class is doing whatever they can to continue to make record profits at this time while putting our lives at risk. And now more than ever, we need to spread the ideas of socialism and the power that the working class can have internationally, as Liv was explaining. The International Socialist Alternative, we are an organization that works tirelessly to help build and support social movements like the ones in Brazil Andre was referencing. But we do it all around the world with the goal to fight capitalism. But we need your help to continue that fight. So please consider donating to the International Socialist Alternative. You can find the link below. You can head to our website or our Facebook. And whether you give $5 or whether you give $500 or euros or reais or pesos, every little bit helps to spread the movement. So now I want to head to some live questions. If you have a question, please put it in the comment and maybe we'll be able to get to it. But our first one is from Northern Ireland from someone named Kevin. So thanks, Kevin, for your question. And it is, what will the historic crisis we are in mean for left politics internationally? He has a couple questions here. Will there be new parties emerged after the last crisis, and how will they be different to what we've seen before? Let's go to the US to Bryan.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin, for that question. Hope you're doing well. So I think that the economic crisis is going to show more and more people that there's a division in society between the haves and have-nots, between the people who work for a living and the parasites who take the wealth from us that we work to create. Yet at the same time, mass unemployment, which is what we're looking at in the US, can create a feeling of fear among workers who have jobs, that if they were to take action, if they were to go on strike, that they can be replaced. What we saw in the US in the 1930s, in one of the biggest waves of struggle in the history of this country, is that there weren't explosive workplace actions for 5 years, or weren't victories for 5 years, and weren't explosive workplace actions for 4 years. And actually, right after the stock market crash of 1929, what we saw was historically low workers' actions, but more people getting involved in the left, a deeper radicalization, unemployed leagues springing up around the country, big struggles around housing, and this paved the way for the mass movement that became the biggest labor upsurge in the history of the country in the mid-1930s, which the far left played a distinctive role in. Now, what's happened in the US in recent months is, just a few weeks ago, we had millions of people supporting a campaign for the presidency that had a feature of a movement that had prominent slogans like "billionaires should not exist," prominent slogans like "we need a government of, by, and for the working class." I'm, of course, talking about the Bernie Sanders campaign. But in this election, just as in what happened after the 2008 crisis, we see the crucial role that leadership plays, and unfortunately, a role that misleadership can play. Right now, in the midst of this pandemic, Bernie Sanders is talking about uniting the Democratic Party, getting behind Joe Biden, and echoing this type of mood that we're all in this together. Yet the reality for working class people shows we're not all in this together. Some of the Democratic Party politicians that Bernie Sanders wants us to unite with are people that, when they got news of the depth of this pandemic, they sold their stocks. That shows how much they care for us. And Bernie supported not just Biden, but the bailouts as well. But more and more, we can see we're not all in this together. The billionaire hoarders in the US, the richest people in the world, have increased their wealth by 10% in the last 6 weeks at the height of this pandemic. Yet at the same time, 30 million new unemployed have, and that's only the official figures of people that have actually applied for unemployment. 30 million new, and 35 million new people are kicked off their healthcare coverage in the US in the midst of a pandemic. So in this situation, in this huge wealth inequality, we will see the growth of new forces in the US. We've already seen dramatic growth of the DSA over the last few years to around 70,000 members. But the vacuum for action, for getting organized, for fighting back against capitalism is much wider than 70,000 people. It's millions of people. And that's these type of struggles from below are gonna be the type of actions that make people realize who their friends are in other working class, poor, and oppressed people, and who their enemies are in both parties of the ruling class. Just in wrapping up, I think when we see the parties that emerged after the 2008 crisis and the type of features on the left that emerge after the 2008 crisis, what we can see there is the failure of a leadership that tries to make a more humane capitalism, that maybe talks about socialism sometimes, but has no concrete way to fight for socialism in the here and now in the midst of this crisis. We saw the failure of Syriza in Greece, the failure of the Maduro government in Venezuela. And what these failures show is that when reformism is unable to take things forward, that the punishment for that is quite severe. That if the left is unable to occupy the vacuum that exists in society and fight for a fundamentally different society, then far-right ideas can grow as well. And this shows the necessity of not just generally left ideas, not just the ideas of struggle, but of revolutionary socialist ideas, of Marxist ideas. And when new parties emerge, when new formations emerge, it's going to be crucial that Marxists intervene in them, especially in the beginning stages, to provide the backbone for those parties with clear ideas of how to take the struggles forward, rather than the failures that we saw in Greece and in other countries.
Thanks so much, Bryan. So just to remind people about the question, because I want to hear what Andre has to say about it, but it was a question from Kevin in Ireland, and in Northern Ireland, excuse me, and it was, what will the historic crisis we are in mean for left politics internationally? Andre?
Well, I think this question from Kevin is crucial, and I agree a lot with the positions and the points that Bryan told us. And I believe that this crisis will have enormous repercussions on consciousness of millions of people, and this will open up an important space for the emergence of, or even the growth of left-wing alternatives. But here in Latin America in particular, it's essential to learn from the experiences of the previous period. So 20 years ago, a great mass movement against neoliberalism began in the whole region, which provoked even revolutionary or revolutionary situations in several countries. Neoliberal governments were overthrown by mass movements in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, etc. Other neoliberal political forces were defeated in elections. And in many countries, this process has resulted in the elections of new governments identified with an anti-neoliberal position. Some were more radicalized by the pressure from below, as in the case of Venezuela with Chavez, but especially after an attempt of coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002. And others were more moderate and conciliatory, as in the case of Brazil, of Lula and the Workers' Party, the PT in Brazil. But in all cases, despite certain achievements obtained by the workers, the demands of the masses were not taken to the last consequences. And all these governments worked within the logic of the capitalist system. So this is evident with Lula and the PT in Brazil, who bet on class conciliation mainly, but it also happened in the case of Venezuela. Despite the socialist rhetoric used by the government and also the strength of the popular mobilization, the government has not broken completely, even with an economic model totally dependent on oil exports, for example. So the same situation also applies to Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, the Kirchners in Argentina, etc. So with the international crisis and the end of the commodity booms, all these countries went into crisis. And this opened the space for a counterattack by the right wing and imperialism that promoted a coup in Brazil in 2016 that opened the space for Bolsonaro at this moment. The same kind of coup continues to be systematically attempted in Venezuela, and in a dramatic way, this kind of coup was achieved in Bolivia last year. So more recently, in 2018, we had the victory of López Obrador in Mexico, defeating a pro-imperialist and criminal neoliberal right-wing candidate. In 2019, in Argentina, the Peronist Alberto Fernandez was elected, defeating the former president and neoliberal president Mauricio Macri. So these governments will not find the same situation as the others so-called progressive governments have found in the past. So there is no commodity boom, and there is an historical crisis of capitalism. There is no basis for a program of gradual reforms within the system and in any kind of conciliation with sectors of the bourgeoisie. So in this context, the only way to guarantee the interests of workers and poor people is to break, for example, with the payment of foreign debts and put the banks and the financial system under workers' control and management. It is to renationalize the companies that have been privatized and the key sectors also of the economy in the same way. It is in reality moving in the direction of breaking with capitalism and building a socialist alternative. Last year's mass struggles in Chile and Ecuador, but also in Colombia, Haiti, Puerto Rico, etc., show the strength of the mass movements, but it is necessary to work for the rebuilding of revolutionary socialist forces in Latin America for the next period.
Thanks, Andre. So I'm going to move right into our last question from the comments. Sorry if we weren't able to get to you, but I want to make sure that all of our speakers have a chance to answer this one because it's good. So it's from Christoph in Austria. Thanks, Christoph, for your question. They say the last deep crisis of capitalism happened in 2008. I think it is important to discuss what we can learn from this crisis. So it says, if you had to pick one lesson from the 2008 crisis for the socialist movement to learn for the current one, what would it be and why? Let's start with Andre. What is your lesson from the 2008 crisis?
Well, Christoph and comrades, I think as the main lesson, I would insist on the need to break with any illusion of a way out of the crisis from within the capitalist system. Also, the need to break with the illusions of any kind of class conciliation as a way out of the crisis. In Latin America, there were some illusions that the 2008 crisis would not arrive here as it did in US and Europe. Lula, for example, in Brazil at that time, even said that while the crisis was a tsunami in the advanced capitalist countries, in Brazil, it would be just a small wave, a little wave. Obviously, this was wrong at that moment, and Lula paid a high price for it. He was arrested, and the PT was overthrown from the government. But this is even more wrong now. So the new crisis comes at a time when Brazil has not even recovered from the previous crisis. This is true also for many other countries. The conditions for the recovery in the economy are much more difficult now. So the main lesson is to have no illusions about a way out where everyone sacrifices a little and have some gains together, where all classes feel contemplated in this situation. So this was the greatest mistake, or even a betrayal in reality, of the PT, the Workers' Party here, to believe in class conciliation and to contain the workers' struggle while caressing the rich. So what should be done is to invest in the organization of the workers from below and to develop a socialist program that links the immediate demands with the historical tasks of the working class. And we need to build the revolutionary socialist forces to maximize that kind of work. I think that is.
Thanks, Andre. Liv, what's your lesson from the 2008 crisis?
I think for me, a really important lesson, maybe more from like the upheavals that followed 2008, like the movements of the Indignados, of the Occupy movement, and the whole period after that with the political developments that Bryan alluded to earlier. I think lessons from that whole period were already beginning to be drawn on the ground and manifesting themselves really powerfully in the uprisings that swept across the world during the course of last year. Like, from Algeria to Sudan to Chile to Iran. Because in these protests against the unbearable conditions of life under capitalism, the sense was already beginning to emerge, I think, that protests cannot be left at just protests. They can't be once off. They must be sustained, they must be spread as movements that reject all the different wings of the elite, of the ruling class, and that begin to recognize the system itself as the problem. I think we were beginning to see this, that unfortunately, those struggles have been put on pause by the pandemic, but the issues are still there. It's boiling under the surface. And I think that the new protests that we've mentioned a bit today, that are already simmering across the world, they need to take on board the lesson that we're up against the system. There's no halfway stop. The movements that will emerge out of this crisis, they need to aim for power, for power over your workplace, over public transport, over your residential areas, over public health, and which all means taking the power away from big business and its spokespeople in politics, and by creating a completely different set of revolutionary working class parties, different to the ones that have been mentioned by Bryan, for example, parties that can take the fight for a socialist world forward.
Thanks, Liv. One more lesson. Let's hear from Bryan. What's your lesson from the 2008 crisis?
Yeah, one thing we should be sober about is it's not going to be easy to change the world for the better. There are huge forces up against us, and things that were done in the wake of the 2008 crisis, included people heroically standing up to, for instance, the dictators in Egypt and throughout North Africa, who were not only sending in tear gas, but sending in live bullets, killing people, imprisoning thousands, tanks, etc. And we see also as well in Greece that there were literally dozens of general strikes. There was a new party thrown up that didn't exist in a meaningful way before the crisis into power on the backs of those movements. Yet we didn't see a socialist transformation of society. In fact, what we've seen since that crisis is things have gotten worse for us. We've seen the growth of the far right as well. And I think what we're going to see this time around is going to be a much deeper economic crisis and a much deeper political polarization as well. It shows that we're going to need that type of determined action that took place last time around, insurrectionary movements, general strikes, mass protests. But in order for them to succeed this time around, as Liv, as Andre mentioned, we need a revolutionary party with a clear program that learns the lessons from history, that learns the lessons internationally about how to take working class struggle forward. That is not easy to build, but that is an absolutely urgent task, as is shown by this pandemic and as is shown by the climate crisis that is worsening and rapidly approaching further devastation. It's an absolutely urgent task that we must take on our shoulders in order to help pull humanity out of this blind alley of capitalism, devastation, and pandemics across the world.
Thanks so much, Bryan, and to all the panelists. If you agree with what you heard, if you like and you want to learn more, please check out our website. It's in the link below. Also check out our Facebook page. We have Instagram pages, Twitter, all over the place. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can stay up to date on our videos, especially for next week. I'm very excited for the discussion on the global climate strike. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and see you next Sunday.